Brought to you by Williams. We make clean energy happen.
Part of my advice that no parent wants their child to hear is you should not have a fallback plan.
I'm Casey Finey, and this is Creative Control. Each month, I'll be interviewing your favorite celebrities and creators to unpack what's at the intersection of creativity, business, and brand building. In this episode, a conversation with musician and activist Moby. Why, hello, everyone. I have to say that I am so excited to be back hosting Creative Control. I took a little break to focus on some other things here at Fast Company, but I have finally returned to doing what I honestly love doing most, which is interviewing genuinely interesting people. And I have to say that Moby has been on my interview bucket list for quite some time now. I feel like most of us know Moby for his prolific music career, but I wouldn't be surprised if most people associate him with his activism, which in a way has become part of his brand. I was really curious to understand what's at the root of Moby's passion for music. I mean, this is a guy who's been consistently putting out albums and tracks for more than 30 years, and that includes giving a lot of it away for free, which we certainly get into. I also wanted to understand his point of view on effective activism. More specifically, how can you use creativity to get people to care about a cause? So to start, I asked Moby what's his origin story as a creative? And in true Moby fashion, as you'll come to understand in this interview, his answer is a journey in itself.
Okay, thank you for asking that. There's so many potential ways self-involvedly for me to look at that. Because there's almost there's the anecdotal approach, which hopefully might be interesting. But then there's the almost more you could look at it from a hereditary perspective, because I come from a weird long line of strange artists and writers and musicians. But in a way, I almost like to look at it psychologically. And what I mean by that is I grew up with a lot of trauma and confusion. I grew up very poor. My mom and I were on food stamps and welfare. Not to be too dramatic, but my dad killed himself when I was 3 years old. There was just a lot of strange violence and trauma. And as time has passed, I've come to recognize that when I was growing up, I sort of gravitated towards the things that made me feel safe and that gave me the ability to see beyond the world I was currently living in as a child. Because when you're dirt poor on food stamps and welfare, living in a crummy house, you're looking for escapism. And for me, those three things were animals, because the people in my life were very unpredictable. They were generally kind of unsafe and dangerous, but animals were very predictable to me, very safe. And not surprisingly, I've been an animal rights activist almost my entire life. But the other two areas, for me, it was literature and music. Literature was a way of pure, controllable, egalitarian escapism, meaning I could go to the library and I could check out a Robert Heinlein book or a Ray Bradbury book, and I could disappear and go somewhere else that was not poor suburban Connecticut. And music was similar, where it was free and it represented entire worlds. When you listen to a David Bowie album, when I was 8 years old and I discovered David Bowie, I was like, oh my God, he's from Europe. I don't even really know what that is, except it's very far away and it seems way more interesting than Stratford, Connecticut.
Understandably so, and fair. I mean, not to disparage Stratford, Connecticut at all, but I'd like to think there's a little bit more going on in Europe. So
yeah,
fair there. So I mean, to that end, I mean, that's such an interesting way to phrase it. Like you had those three things that were your form of escapism, and obviously, as you mentioned, you've been a pretty much lifelong animal rights activist. You've obviously had such a successful career in music. And I know that for a while you thought that you were going to teach philosophy. And so I'm just curious, how music sort of, animal rights is still part of your life, but music definitely kind of won out. That's what we primarily know you for. So how did that sort of edge out over, say, studying and teaching philosophy?
Wow, that's a really interesting question. I'm going to have to bring that up with my therapist because, because there was this moment in the late 80s I never quite finished college, but I kept going back sporadically. And for a brief moment, I was like, okay, maybe I'll try and get my PhD. And I was also really fascinated with theology. And so I thought, okay, I'll be a philosophy professor, I'll teach theology, and I'll make music in my spare time, and no one will ever listen to it, but that's okay. It'll just be something I love. But then I guess the world of music at that time was just so exciting. Philosophy is fascinating. Philosophy is super interesting, and I still love it. But in a way, it just couldn't compete with the thrill of music. The history of music, the 20th century history of music was just so, everything about it was interesting and exciting and emotional and powerful and at times revolutionary. So I became a dilettante philosophy person and a full-time musician just because, I don't know, Kant and Kierkegaard are great, but they can't really, when it's the middle of the 80s and they're trying to compete with Nirvana and Public Enemy and the birth of house music and Eric B. and Rakim and et cetera, et cetera. It's like, yeah, so
So what about that music would you say that that era of music, you responded to it because, that's around the age, like when most, I guess, like when people, are sort of absorbing everything around them and everything feels like, like new and amazing, or like, was there something genuinely in that music? Because I think a lot of people coming of age now, like when you were coming of age, in the 80s, a lot of people can say that about, the feeling that they have about music now, so to speak. And so I guess like what really was it about that era that felt so electric to you? Like, what was it outside of just that's when you were sort of coming of age in a way?
it's a great question because obviously there's something very seductive in the familiar. I'm 59 years old, so like on one hand, when I look at the music and culture I grew up with, like I still love it because it's so familiar and it's woven into my DNA. But if I take a step back, one thing I will say is popular music, modern music from about 1920 until fairly recently was in a state of constant reinvention. One genre would become another genre, would become another hybridized genre, would become something else, and then technology would intervene, and all of a sudden that would change the sound of music. So when I was becoming aware of music in the 70s, there had been the rock revolution, which became R&B, that became reggae, that became disco, and then it became hip hop, it became punk rock, it became electronic music, it became new wave, it became post-punk, it became sample-based hip hop. And then it's like every 6 months there was something new. And it was so fascinating being around that. And then in the late 80s, not only was the technology new, but the culture, everything, it just felt so like it was constantly reinventing itself, especially like in the worlds of hip hop and house music and techno, where the clothes were new, the record labels were new, the drugs were new, everything was in this state of invention. And I guess I just sort of assumed that would always be the case. The irony, not to sound like a cranky old guy, but like now, in terms of music and culture, it feels like it stopped in reinventing itself a few decades ago.
Why do you think that is? I mean, I agree. I mean, I'll count myself among the cranky old people in the room, but why do you think that is?
Yeah, it's also a great question. And as a 59-year-old, I also don't trust my perspective on that. But like I look at, the genres today that musicians are mainly working in are genres that existed 20, 30 years ago.
Sure.
you know, and it's worth remembering, like, when I fell in love with electronic music in 1985, like 30 years before that, it was 1955. So, like,
Uh,
that idea of embracing genres that were created decades before, it doesn't speak to the quality of the music because obviously there are phenomenal hip hop producers now, phenomenal house music producers. There's phenomenal music being made, but I just wonder where's this generation's ownership? Where's the sui generis aspect of them creating genres, creating culture that is 100% their own? And so to your question, I think a big part of it is maybe just the amount of information. And sorry, I'm stating the obvious, but back in the ye olden days of the 1980s, your options were like, well, I can read a newspaper, I can watch the nightly news, I can watch banal sitcoms, I can see the occasional movie, or I can focus on music. And now I don't understand how kids have the time to do anything now, because there's that onslaught of information. I was at a friend of mine's house recently, and she has a 13-year-old, and at the same time he was like on Snapchat, DMing his friends, playing Minecraft or some game, also while doing homework and listening to music, and also possibly making, like, all at the same time. And so I think maybe that's when you're so overwhelmed by data and information platforms, maybe you don't even feel like it's within the realm of possibility to invent anything, because you're so busy surfing on all these other platforms. You're like, whereas back in the 80s, we were bored.
Right.
And we're like, I got plenty of time. I guess I'll go invent a genre.
That's an interesting take. That's a very interesting take. And, I'm glad that you brought up, you said you really fell in love with electronic music in 1985 because, I know that you started playing guitar, which led to you studying classical music and music theory, and you studied, piano and jazz and percussion and all these things. And I know you were really heavy into like in the punk scene as well. I know that was very transformative for you. But we know you primarily as an electronic musician. So what about this genre really stuck for you? And I know that you can explore different genres there, like within electronic, but that's really what stuck. And knowing that you came from this very wide pool of options, so to speak. Like why am I not talking to Moby the jazz musician or Moby the guitarist? Like what about electronica really stuck for you?
If you were talking to my music teacher back when I was really young, he still, I think his heart is broken by that, because he was training me to be a virtuoso. Like, I was supposed to be a virtuoso jazz guitarist or a classical guitarist. And then I heard The Clash, and I was like, oh, I like jazz, I like classical music, but it can't compete with The Clash. And then I heard electronic music, which at the time was everything from, Kraftwerk and Africa Bambaataa. I was like, it sounded like, it was like science fiction moved to the city, and it was just so exciting. And the potential, like, a guitar is perfectly fine. I love a good guitar. A guitar will never really make more than 6 notes at a time. And more often than not, guitars sound like guitars. Whereas I remember walking into a music store on 48th Street in New York, either Manny's or Sam Ash, and it was the first time I'd ever played a synthesizer. And I was like, oh, this sounds like everything. Do you want it to be a bass? It's a bass. Do you want it to be a piano? It's a piano. An organ. And I was just like, maybe it's the solipsism in me, or like the product of being an only child. But I was like, wow, if I have electronic instruments, I don't need to work with other people. I can just sit in my bedroom all the time with my equipment and just make music by myself and not wait for the drummer to come over with his girlfriend, or wait for the bass player and his boyfriend to have a fight so the bass player will show up. Like,
Okay, so it's born out of the desire, the introverted desire of like being alone. Got it.
and I think that's true for a lot of people who come from that world, like whether it's Trent Reznor, a lot of us electronic music producers, like, we're okay with other people, but more often than not, we kind of like to just work by ourselves. Like, I went to Danny Elfman's studio, and it was so funny because he has this probably 20,000 square foot studio. You could put 1,000 people in there, and he sits in one small room by himself. And I was like, yeah, it makes perfect sense to me.
Right. Yeah, and I've actually interviewed Danny Elfman. He is oh God, I'm a huge fan of his. And getting inside of his creative process was very interesting. But, I know that, one of the many things that I find impressive about your career is how prolific you've been. I mean, to date, you've released what, I want to say like over 30 albums. I mean, that seems about right. It's like about, if you parse out like studio albums versus like, live recordings, etc. But like, it's been over 30, all of which are 1 to 3 years apart. Like, there's not many gaps in your discography. So what is at the root of your productivity? Because that's very impressive. Like, you've been going pretty much nonstop since the late 90s, since you sort of debuted. So, like, what is at the root of that?
Well, it's funny because especially now that I'm old, a question I get asked a lot is to give people advice. Like, what advice do you have for up and coming musicians? And part of my advice is advice that really is not helpful. Like I have some advice that parents do not want to hear. Some of it's really nice, like you should love what you do and you should learn how to do everything. You know, in the world of music, like learn how to be a producer, a musician, a DJ, a film composer, a remixer, like learn how to be a polymath, learn how to do everything. But part of my advice that no parent wants their child to hear is you should not have a fallback plan.
Yep.
Because nothing kills a creative career more than having a plan B. So in my case, like, I don't know how to really do anything else. Like, so when it comes to music, like, I love working on music, but also I don't know how to do anything else. So, I mean, I grew up working in a darkroom, so I guess I can take photos, but beyond that, like, I have no practical skills at all. And so there are those moments when I was growing up where it looked like music was not working out.
Hmm.
And most smart, prepared people would then fall back on the plan B, like move to Florida and sell real estate, make meme coins, whatever people do now. Whereas my fallback was move to an abandoned factory and keep making music.
You know what? That makes sense, actually. No, honestly, it does, because I think that that is the rational thing, to always have a fallback. But to your point, I think a lot of people maybe put away their creative aspirations sometimes too soon, because it is very hard for a lot of people to make a stable career from it. So it's very easy to just kind of hit the eject button and just parachute into something else. Whereas, there's so much to be said for, it may sound foolish, but just sticking with it and just continuing down that path, as bleak as it may seem. Because I know even with, your album Play, you talked about like how you thought that that would be like your last album. And that turned out to be the album that made you like a crossover hit into the quote unquote mainstream. So, I mean, I find that it's really interesting, because, I mean, you say that there was no backup plan, but you do have other interests. So, I mean, really, like, what for you is like at the root of music in general? Because it seems like that and animal rights are like, biggest passions you have. So, like, what is it about it that just kind of kept you going down this path? Like, I think that it is, like I said, it's admirable, but it also is a little, a little terrifying. So I love unpacking those people's, that like steadfast nature, that like tunnel vision people have for the things that they're passionate about. So for you, like, what really is it about music?
Something happened that changed my understanding of music radically in around 2002. One of my oldest friends got involved with this organization called the Institute for Music and Neurologic Function.
Mm.
And it was started by Oliver Sacks, who was a famous neurologist and musicologist, and Dr. Connie Tomeno, who's also a famous neurologist. And the movie Awakenings was based on Oliver Sacks. And what they realized by using like fMRIs and PET scans and other diagnostics is that music isn't just fun. Music isn't just nice, but it's actually neurochemically, physiologically, and even regarding our endocrine system, it's transformational. And when I met with them and I got involved with this organization, I was like, oh, I've spent my entire life in love with music. I've spent my entire life obsessed with music and making music, but I always thought it was just music. It was fun. It was emotional. And what they taught me is that no, when you're listening to music and when you're having that profound emotional reaction, or when you're making music and when you're fully invested in it, it actually affects your brain. It affects your body. And it was really like a Saul on the road to Damascus moment for me. I was like, oh, music, it's a healing modality.
Mm.
And they've been able to show, I mean, there's an amazing movie called Alive Inside about the use of music therapy with Alzheimer's patients. And if you haven't seen it, it's a few years old, but boy, is it powerful. And one of the things that they discovered, also working with this other PhD, Daniel Levitin, is that music promotes neurogenesis. Because I don't know about you, but when I was growing up, I was told you have a finite number of brain cells and you hit age 8 and they'd start dying and there's nothing you can do. And that, of course, terrified me because I'm a recovering alcoholic and drug addict. And I was like, oh boy, if I started with a finite number, I certainly haven't helped the sloughing off process. But what they've learned is that music therapy and other types of activities actually promote neurogenesis, specifically in the hippocampus. So I found that to be so encouraging. And so that changed my perspective on music, that music was no longer a job. It was no longer just something I loved. It was science. Like it was healing. And then the other thing I'll add, which makes so much sense to me, and if it doesn't make sense to anyone else, it's probably either I'm doing a bad job explaining it or I'm just dim-witted. I don't know. But I had this epiphany. I was playing a festival, and before I went on, I was looking at the opening band, who I think was the band Kaiser Chiefs. And they were playing, and so there's 75,000 kids jumping up and down. And I was looking at this, and I was like, all of a sudden it dawned on me, and bear with me because it might sound insane, music has never existed. There has never actually been such a thing as music. All it is taking existing air molecules and moving them a little differently. It's never created anything. The same way you could say cinema is just light molecule, like light photons, I guess. But the fact that 75,000 kids were jumping up and down because the air molecules were hitting them differently than they had been before the song started. Same air molecules, just hitting them differently. And all of a sudden, I had this thought, which was music is, and I mean this as a sort of nerdy pun, it's the incarnation of spirit, meaning it has no weight, it has no corporeal mass, but it's one of the most powerful things on the planet. And so that was, in conjunction with working with the Institute for Music and Neurologic Function, that also made me realize that working on music, listening to music, having an emotional response to music is incredibly, by definition, spiritual.
We'll be back after a quick break.
As affordable, reliable energy demand increases at historic rates, one company is uniquely positioned to accelerate America forward. Williams. We have 117 years of know-how in powering progress, and we're ready to power the next 100 years of innovation. Learn how our natural gas infrastructure is critical to the future of AI at williams.com.
And we're back. So one of the many things I find interesting about Moby is Mobygratis, which is his platform where people can download tracks made by Moby for free to use in any number of creative projects. Moby launched Mobygratis in 2005, and he's been building on it ever since. Here, he explains how it all got started.
One of my times when I was in university, I was studying philosophy at SUNY Purchase, and SUNY also had a really robust film program. And I had a lot of friends in the experimental film program who then went on to become relatively accomplished filmmakers. And their recurring complaint and frustration was how hard it was to get music for their films, especially small budget indie films. And like friends of mine who would be maxing out their credit cards and getting a third mortgage on their house to make a film, and then finding out that like the most difficult part of making the film was getting the music. And so I started Mobygratis as a way of just giving unreleased music to filmmakers, to nonprofits, to NGOs, to students. And I didn't really do much with it. Like we put a few hundred pieces of music there and then largely left it alone, and people kept finding it. And then during the pandemic, one of my projects was to go through all of my unreleased music and finish it in instrumental form and create multi-tracks so we could repopulate Mobygratis with about, eventually there'll be 2,000 or 3,000 songs on there, which is basically songs that I'd never released that are free for pretty much anyone to do whatever they want with. Hopefully there's more to it. There's a sort of we'll call it like the democratic chaos and the dialectic of putting things out into the world and not controlling them, or trying not to control them, and just being like, okay, I've made this music, I'm putting it out in the world. If someone discovers it, great. If they can use it, great. If they don't discover it, that's fine. There's a lot of other things in the world. But it's really this idea of selfishly seeing what people do with my music, and maybe more altruistically letting them do whatever they want with it.
Yeah. And I think it's important to note, especially now in the 2025 of it all, that all of this music on Mobygratis you made. Like it's not you using AI in any capacity. And so, how would you describe your relationship to AI and creativity?
What a question.
Yeah.
Just to be clear, all the music on Mobygratis is just the product of me alone in my studio. And, the fact that I don't date, I don't really have a family, I don't socialize that much. I have a lot of time to work on music. So there's no AI involved.
The creative community thanks you for that. Truly.
Yeah. But it's funny, I had dinner with a friend of mine who is the only person I know who seems to, because he's involved in a lot of different facets of AI, from film production to animation and video game production and science and tech. He's the only person I know who's not siloed in his approach to AI. And I was able to I had dinner with him, and he became my personal TED Talk of one. He basically answered all my questions and told me, his predictions, some of which are terrifying. And the only conclusion I can come to is that there is simply no way to really have an opinion about AI, because, at least for me, I'll just keep my perspective is, there's so many variables and it's evolving at such an incredibly rapid rate. And I can't generalize and say oh, people who are developing synthetic lithium expedited by AI, how does that relate to someone making a deep fake of Vladimir Putin skydiving? I don't know how to use any of it. I was telling my friend on Saturday, who's the AI expert, I was like, I can't even get ChatGPT to say nice things about me. So clearly I don't know how any of this works. The only thing I will say is I understand my limited understanding. I understand people's apprehension around AI, their fear of AI. But when I look at the history of disruption, especially in the world of entertainment, film disrupted vaudeville, talkies disrupted silent films. Everything has been constantly disrupting everything else. And historically, it's a very potentially controversial thing to say, but I'm just looking at it empirically. Resisting disruption tends to not benefit the person who's resisting the disruption. The people in silent film who resisted talkies, their careers didn't do that well. The people in rock bands who've resisted electronic music, unfortunately, sadly, things have not worked out too well for them. It's there's so many examples of that, of even if you hate the disruption, even if the disruption seems unethical, there's very little benefit for the creator in not at least examining it and trying to take the best parts of it and incorporate it into your work. So what makes me sad living in Los Angeles is there's so many people, understandably, whose livelihoods are being threatened. But by rejecting the technology, by resisting the disruption, their careers are not going to benefit. Which, I'm not pro AI, but I'm saying if you're about to be hit by a tsunami, you can't really tell the tsunami to go fuck off, because it's not going to pay attention.
Right. Right. That is an entirely fair approach. And for someone who said that, you don't have any opinions on it, that was definitely.
But also, what I will say is I don't understand it. When I say no opinions, meaning I'm not pro or con, I just try and contextualize it within the history of disruptive tech. And it's rarely disruptive tech. It's rarely good or bad.
Yeah.
It depends who's using it, how it's being used. And so hopefully someday I'll have a better understanding of AI, rather than just me going on Midjourney and not knowing how to write a prompt.
When you think about the resources that creatives have and, access to it. I mean, we're of course living in a time where so much of it is democratized. It's never been easier to, start a podcast or, pick up an instrument, et cetera, et cetera. And I think Mobygratis is so fascinating because, it started from a direct thing that you were saying about, your friends not being able to afford music to license in their film. So when you think about creativity and commerce and, the resources that creators have, like, how do you see Mobygratis playing out in all of that? And how do you see it evolving?
I mean, on my end, again, like I'm 59 years old. I don't know how the modern world works, but I'm sort of fascinated by it. And on my end, all I want to do is keep putting music up there and restricting it as little as possible. Like that was originally one of the challenges with Mobygratis is convincing everyone I work with to remove all the restrictions.
Yeah.
Like I don't want to be the police. So there are some restrictions. Like in theory, you're not allowed to use the music on Mobygratis to promote right-wing politics or meat and dairy.
Hmm.
But I'm also not the police. So if someone uses the music contrary to the user agreement, I'll probably never find out about it.
That's my question. Is there any way of tracking infractions? So, yeah.
Only if it's brought to my attention
Sure.
or if it's really egregious or high profile. But I love erring on the side of democratic chaos, putting it out there and having no idea what's going to happen. That's the joy in it for me, is just trusting the chaos in a way. And that's also why I've structured it so I can never make money from it.
Right.
I'm not opposed to revenue streams. Revenue streams can be nice. They enable me to have sweatshirts, and when we're done talking, I'll probably go make a sandwich. These things are the product of revenue. But it is a question, and I'm sure that you're in the eye of the storm. The middle of this is the role of wealth. What's the goal of wealth?
Whoa, Moby. I think
Yeah.
about this all the time. No, I mean, we see this play out where I'm forever just fascinated and horrified in equal measure at the people who seem to have everything and yet want more. And I think as someone who personally, I've never really wanted for much. Like I never grew up thinking, oh, I want to be a millionaire or a billionaire when I grow up. I just want to make enough and, do good things in the world. And that's really it. And so that's why I'm so fascinated and just so ready to applaud people like you, people who are thinking about ways to give back, whether it is to the creative community, whether it is to animal rights, environmentalism, et cetera, because it's like there's more people who have more resources and access than the average person. Those are the people that really should be thinking about this. Yet and still, we see so many examples of people with extraordinary wealth just wanting more and more at the cost of everyone beneath them. And it's horrifying. So I spent a lot of time thinking about that.
Well, it's horrifying, but it's also confusing because a lot of these people are pretty smart. Like a lot of very wealthy people, like, they've got their PhDs. They're not stupid people, but there's this unwillingness to look at evidence. And what I mean by that is I think of this one experience I had in the early 2000s. I got invited to a birthday party, and it was, I forget, the Lafrac family?
Yeah. Yeah. Not personally, but yes, I know.
Yeah,
of them.
so somehow I got invited to the older Lafracs. I guess it was his 60th birthday, 70th birthday. They had rented the Hammerstein Ballroom. Earth, Wind, and Fire were playing.
Of course.
There were 150 invited guests, and Trump was there, Michael Bloomberg was there, Steve Schwartzman was there. It was the New York Billionaires Club, and somehow I was there. And I remember sitting there, I was like, this is the pinnacle of wealth. Like, no one there apart from me, they're all billionaires, basically. Well, I guess Trump at the time was not, but like the wealthiest people on the planet at this party, no one was smiling.
Mm.
No one was laughing. No one was having a good time. And when Earth, Wind, and Fire came on, some of them got up and danced, but joylessly. And then I looked over and there was a door by the kitchen, and the wait staff and the kitchen staff were having the best party of, like, they were dancing and they were happy and they were smiling. And I was like, so you got the billionaires over here who are joyless and the kitchen staff who are just smiling and happy. I was like, what's the point in owning the world if you're not doing good and making yourself happy in the process? Like, because I grew up poor white trash in Connecticut, but I was around excessive, like ridiculous amounts of wealth. And I never, at an early age, and I'm sure you've experienced this as well, is like, I never saw the sort of like empirical correlation between wealth and happiness. Like, some wealth is great. It's really nice to be able to turn on the air conditioning when it's 105 degrees outside.
For
I
sure.
really appreciate organic blueberries. Like, some things about having a little bit of money can be great. But then when you get to a certain point, like Elon and Jeff Bezos, like, I used to be friends with these guys. Like, why do they want more? Why, you're Mark Zuckerberg, why do you need $100,000 watch? Like, it's the why of it, because none of them seem happy. There's this desperation. And I'm like, go do some good. Like, try to make the world a better place. Like, live in a simple house, have one car. If you want a boat, have a canoe. Like, just go paddle around a lake rather than having some $750 million boat parked off on Tebe or whatever. You know, like, it would be an interesting academic question if they weren't also ending democracy and destroying the planet.
Jesus. This is something, like I said, I think about all the time, and I could also ramble about, and this kind of ties into this conversation because I really want to talk about Little Walnut, which is your production company. And I know that the Little Walnut sits at the intersection of creativity and activism. It's really using storytelling in a way that draws attention to the issues that you are really focusing on. And so I'd love to hear a little bit about what prompted you to start Little Walnut and some of the impact that you may have seen so far.
So it dovetails perfectly into what we were just talking about. So about 20 some odd years ago, I got to hang out with the Dalai Lama.
As one does.
As one does. Yeah, just, casual. And he said something, and I don't think of myself as religious. I like Buddhism. What?
You did a Christian phase when you're in your 20s. I know about that.
Yeah, I'm just a weird, I like trees and squirrels. Like, I don't really have a religious orientation at this point. So I'm hanging out with the Dalai Lama, as one does, and he was talking about the key to happiness being service.
Mm-hmm.
And selflessness. And at the time, I was a drunk, I was a drug addict, I was touring constantly. I was definitely not selfless. And when he said that, I was so irritated because I wanted him to be wrong. I was like, no, I want the key to happiness to be owning the right stuff and having the right amount of validation from third parties. And I want it to be having the perfect trophy wife and this, and I want my materialist portfolio should be the key to happiness. But then
imagine being irritated at the Dalai Lama.
I know.
Anyway, it's got the best image in my mind, but go on.
But I wanted the key to happiness to be selfishness, because that's what our culture tells us. Is like, sure, it gives lip service to philanthropy, but ultimately our culture, lionizes the billionaires and the sociopaths. So then I got sober and I started doing some spiritual work and therapy. And over time, I realized, again, empirically, looking at the evidence, that the more I pursued selfishness, the less happy I was. It was just evident. And the people I was around, the more selfish they were, the less happy they were. And I was like, oh, damn it, Dalai Lama, you were right. So it made me realize that, like, the key to well-being, the key, I think, to a good life is, it sounds like a teabag saying, but like, it's seeing how you can use your talents, your resources, your abilities to make the world a better place. Doesn't mean you will make the world a better place, but at least that should be the goal. And so then I got involved with a bunch of different sort of like high profile 501c3s, charities, and foundations. And I realized foundations are great, but as you probably know, they're very restricted in what they can do. They can't be involved in politics. They can't really be involved in commerce except for fiscal sponsorship. There's a lot of stuff they can't do. But a lot of rich people only have foundations as their vehicle for philanthropy. And I realized for me, service and philanthropy structurally is like a pie. And thanks for letting me ramble on about all this stuff.
No, yes, this is the perfect place to ramble. Pause. You mentioned that you keep saying ramble, like, but what you're saying is so important and fascinating. Like a ramble meanders and goes nowhere. Like you always land at a point. I've seen so many interviews with you where you pontificate and have these very long, rich answers, but they always land at a point. So never feel like you have to apologize for quote unquote rambling because it's not, yeah, no, 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 no.
Okay. I guess in my mind, I'm just always afraid that I'm going to at some point end up like Grandpa Simpson.
No. You're not yelling at clouds. You're doing fine.
To continue my non-ramble that I should not apologize for, I started to see activism and philanthropy as this pie. And one quarter of the pie is 501c3s, traditional nonprofit philanthropy, which is great. Another quarter for me was politics, the world of C4s and PACs. Then the other half of it is media and commerce, because especially in the world of animal activism, media is profoundly important. And commerce, think of, the clothing brands, think of Miyoko's vegan cheese, think of Impossible and Beyond. They're not doing that well right now, but still, like commerce is a very essential part of many types of activism. I had my foundation and then a donor advised fund. That's the 501c3 part. The political part, my friends and I do a lot, like we go back and forth to DC, which is not my favorite thing to do, but it can yield really good results. But then the media side is what you mentioned, is Little Walnut, the production company. And it's not didactic necessarily, but when activist storytelling works, it changes the world. And I don't know if I'll ever do that, but what a great aspiration. When I think of like the movie Philadelphia, or even think of Will and Grace, I see those two pieces of content as basically almost like a direct line to marriage equality. And I think of a mate like Selma, basically these phenomenal stories that change people's hearts and minds. And so with Little Walnut, that's our obsession. That's our focus, is how do we use our tiny little limited resources to support other people's creativity, but also to use our creativity to help tell stories that are not shameful, that are not finger pointing, that are not just like documentaries or stories that no one wants to actually pay attention to, but how do you create, like Babe being the perfect example, like a beautiful story that also has an animal rights component. Even Wicked, to me, Wicked, if you take a step back, it's actually a treatise on animal rights.
Oh, yeah.
When you can do that, when you can use creativity and resources to tell beautiful stories that also make the world better. I just see that as being such an essential task, an essential, dharma, as it were.
You're completely right. And I know that two things can exist at the same time. You can have these beautiful, well-told, artful narratives that you push out into the world that have, the deeper meanings that there's almost feel like subliminal messages in a way. And those get attention. But for me, it's like, there is nothing wrong with just watching a straightforward documentary or like reading the book. And so for you, I mean, I think, is that anything that you wrestle with, having to sort of wrap medicine in baloney so people can actually make it in, like, or does it not matter to you?
It's, the nature of service. If I'm being honest, it's this strange little part of my brain that just says, and I don't know if I'm allowed to paraphrase Malcolm X, but it's like, by any means necessary. It's like, what works? Like, what can I do that will reach people? And if that's a documentary, God bless, we're going to make a documentary. If that's supporting influencers who actually are trying to create good content, we're going to try and do that. It's simply every second of every day, hopefully saying, what more can I do and how can I do it? Either it's making it myself or helping other people. And it's that core. Hopefully that doesn't sound like virtue signaling. I feel like once you have that core, the rest of the world stops making much sense. And I almost, in a way, this is going to sound really obnoxious, but I almost feel sorry for the Trumps and the Elons and the whomevers of like, oh, dedicate yourself to service. Maybe they think they are. No, Trump definitely does not think he's making the world a better place. Like I'm sure that at some point he's going to like unzip his skin suit and reveal that he's some sort of weird robot lizard underneath. But any case, we look at the world and we see so many people like going out just trying to look after themselves, and the consequences are dystopian. So, which is, sure, we're all self-interested. I love sitting down and having a bowl of spaghetti and watching an old 30 Rock episode. Like, is that making the world a better place? Probably not. But boy, is it delightful. So I'm not saying that I'm wearing a hair shirt and every day waking up and like self-flagellating and only trying to make the world a better place. Like, sure, I'm selfish at times as well, but the meaning in life, I think, has to come from trying to understand the world insofar as we can and figure out where the world is going wrong and figure out how we push the needle back towards something that seems sane and sustainable.
So to kind of summarize all of these non-rambling tangents that we've gone on, we've talked about creativity in the context of service, in the context of activism, in the context of healing. And I'm just curious, like knowing from your vantage point now, knowing that you've had this incredible career, like how are you defining creativity now? What does that word mean to you?
And I don't know, imagine if I was a religious person, I would say it's sort of following in the footsteps of whatever the divine is. Because I look at the universe seems to be really constantly busy creating stuff. And like one of my favorite, this is going to sound very odd, one of my favorite things to do is to do my own landscaping.
That sounds relaxing, not odd.
I love it. I'm not good at a lot of it, but and one of the things I do is in the autumn here in Los Angeles, I will take the leaves that have fallen and I sweep them back onto the soil. Because I was like, well, that's what nature does. Seems like that's pretty smart. And when I do that, I recognize the systemic aspect of it. Like you walk through a forest and you see, the leaves have fallen, the branches have fallen, and without that, life would not be sustained. So it's the repurposing. Nature, if I take a step back, to me, creativity is it's celebratory repurposing. It's creation, because it's nothing's ever created from nothing. It might sound like a double negative, and so being involved in that, going into the world with that celebratory spirit of like, I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm going to joyfully try and make stuff that seems like it's contributing somewhere, somehow.
That is beautiful. That is actually very beautiful. Oh, Moby, this has been wonderful. And the thing is, I actually had a few more questions, but I feel like I don't want to monopolize your time. So I'm just going to leave it there because that, I think, is such a beautiful way to wrap up this conversation. So thank you for your time and thank you for this insight. And I'm going to reuse that. I'm going to repurpose that. Celebratory.
Okay. Yeah, just like the trees repurpose their leaves.
Exactly. No, this is great. Wonderful.
Well, thank you. I feel the same way. I've done a lot of interviews, but this is definitely like in my top 3. So thank you for taking the time.
You say that to every bald African-American man sitting in a purple room.
Yeah, but I can tell you choose to be bald. That's as someone who has no choice. That's a very different thing.
Fair enough. Okay, you heard the man. This interview is in his top 3 favorites, and I have to say the feeling is mutual. My main takeaways from my conversation with Moby is how to use creativity in service of a greater good, why it's okay to not have a backup plan, And honestly, just a new way to think about music as a whole, from its impact on our health and well-being to really understanding what music is and isn't. Creative Control is part of the Fast Company Podcast Network. Our show is produced and edited by Blake Odom with help from Avery Miles, Sam Gebauer, and Hawa Atori. Mix and sound design is by Nicholas Torres, and our executive producer is Josh Christensen. Be sure to subscribe to Creative Control on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can hear all episodes in the most innovative company's podcast feed. If you like this podcast, which I hope you did, leave us a rating and review on your podcast app of choice, or let us know in the comments of Fast Company's social media. We're basically on every app you can think of. See you in a few weeks.